Hey, welcome back to the program. So how about this for a skim and a scam? The Medicaid program, at least in some states, is being used to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars into union coffers, even though there's a United States Supreme Court decision saying you can't do that. How can this possibly be true? If you go to the MacIverInstitute.com website today, you'll see an article. It's right there on the front page. Senator Ron Johnson is asking for the government to take a look at what is going on here and how it's possible that despite a Supreme Court ruling, Medicaid dollars are being directly diverted into the coffers of unions. I've got Mark Mix on the program from the National Right to Work Foundation to talk about this, because the first time I saw this story today, Mark, I said, wow, it seems like I've talked about that before. It's good to have you on the program.
Indeed, Vicki, good to be on with you. You're right. We've talked about it before. We talked about it when the Supreme Court decided a case called Harris v. Quinn, which was a case out of Illinois, where 8 mothers who were taking care of their developmentally disabled adult children at home and were participating in the Medicaid program were compelled, or 3 of them were compelled, the other 5 were about to be compelled, to have money taken out of this Medicaid stipend and sent directly to the SEIU to speak for them. The Supreme Court had something to say about that. They said they couldn't do it. It was a violation of their First Amendment rights. But yet 11 states continue to do it to the tune of over $200 million a year.
So how is this going on? Because it from what I'm reading, and it's a bit confusing, but it seems like they think they found a workaround solution to the Supreme Court decision, or is this just overtly illegal behavior? In which case, then what do you do?
Yeah, well, it's illegal behavior under the Medicaid free choice provider provisions in the law, in the regulations. In fact, I was at the White House today briefing executives of the White House about this very issue, about the fact that this was being done in violation of the code and the regulation that surrounds Medicare. 11 states have done it. 9 states passed laws. 2 states have executive orders that basically say the only way you can participate in the Medicaid program is to commission a unionized personal care assistant. So 11 states say you cannot have anyone that doesn't belong to a union. And they do this through various regulatory schemes at the state level by statute or by executive order that basically says in order to participate, you've got to have a union provider. And we believe that's wrong. We believe, first of all, it's a violation of the Medicaid code. And secondly, it's in contrast to the Supreme Court decision back in 2012 in Harris v. Quinn.
It seems like it's in direct contradiction to the Harris v. Quinn decision. This is not an old decision. This is a new decision, but it's not so new that states can't have figured this out before. So basically they say, oh, yeah, if you actually want to receive care through Medicaid for the care of your elderly relative or your developmentally disabled relative, already a fairly low stipend, I might point out, we're going to first take 3.2% of your Medicaid reimbursement for wages, and we're just going to send that off to the union. And there's a Supreme Court decision on this. I mean, you can't believe how overt this is. And yet they're saying, well, they signed a form. They signed a form that says right here that they have the option to get out of the union if they want to. And here's the form that they signed saying they wanted to be in the union, even though, of course, they're compelled to do so in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. And it was a 2014 case. We won that case in 2014. We had another case in 2012 that was kind of on point here, but suffice to say, the 2014 decision spoke to this question directly. In fact, Vicki, the real injustice here is that the money is being skimmed off and sent to a third party prior to it getting to the recipient, and that is a clear violation of the Medicaid code. Under the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services is supposed to regulate this under their regulations, and they're not doing it. And so we've asked the administration, just like Senator Johnson did. I mean, he's asking for information. We're telling him, stop it. Stop it. We don't know. I mean, we know it's happening. Just stop it.
And what can the government do to stop this? That's the question. Do they just simply withhold reimbursements for Medicaid, in which case these home health care workers, of course, what the unions are going to do is say, look what they're doing. They're trying to starve the home health care workers. What does the federal government do to try to force compliance with the law?
Well, Health and Human Services, and specifically the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, could actually tell these officially tell these 11 states that they are in violation of the free choice of provider provision under the Act. They just got to stop it. They've got to stop it.
So that's what they just say. Stop, or we will sue you. Stop, or we will take you to court. Stop, or you will be on the hook for substantial fines. But this is just how insidious it is. You can get determinations and declarations that say you are a right to work state, you have these particular protections, and they oftentimes can just simply be ignored. In Wisconsin, we've got a right to work law, and yet so many different times we're hearing stories about people trying to exercise their rights under the right to work law, only to be told by the union that they missed a window to get out of the union, and so they're going to have to be in it for another year or something like that. And so the unions just simply do not want to comply with the law unless there's a metaphorical gun to their head forcing them to comply with the law.
That's right. And unfortunately, since 2015, when Wisconsin passed their right to work law, we still have litigation on behalf of employees there. We still have litigation on behalf of employees in Michigan that passed their right to work law in 2012. It went into effect in 2013. And basically what that says is union officials, union bosses who think they can get away with it will continue to try to do so.
Exactly. Because now it requires an actual overt act by the government to stop them. And in this case, we're talking about Medicaid here, this would have to be an act of the government to go after the states, right? Or would they have to go after the individual unions that are receiving the dollars?
Well, the state receives the dollars, so that's how So
you go after the states. This is actually easier than in some cases. It's actually easier, instead of having to go after various different unions, to simply go after the states here.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because now that Johnson's exposed it, hopefully it'll get a little more attention and it will stop. We still have a case pending at the U.S. Supreme Court called Riffey v. Rauner that calls into question about $32 million that were extracted from home health care providers in the state of Illinois that we want to give it back to them because the Harris v. Quinn decision. In fact, Governor Rauner wrote a letter to the Medicare Center saying, please tell us that we can't do this anymore. Back in January of 2018 of this year, asking for guidance about how this is working because Illinois still has this problem, but yet we hope that the Supreme Court will agree to hear a case that is a class action on behalf of all the personal care providers in Illinois to get that money back, which is now more than $32 million.
Yeah, because the money's gone. Now
exactly.
There's one thing to get them to stop. There's another thing to get the money returned because the money was collected illegally. Here's another story. It has nothing to do with Medicare, Medicaid, or anything like that. It's just, again, another example of the mentality of the labor unions to never, ever want to find ways to comply, but to always try to want to find workarounds. You and I have talked about work groups as opposed to unions. A union actually calls itself a work group. Suddenly it's not bound by the National Labor Relations Act. We have that going on in Madison for employees in order to try to, quote, negotiate wages, but they function as a union. So that's one of the ways you see the workarounds. Here's another one. Another case out of Wisconsin. An electrician that employs both union and non-union workers, he employs service veterans, is now being taken to federal court where the only goal of the union trust fund's lawyers is to get the discovery process, get the names of his employees so the unions can essentially shake down employees to force them to sign up and pay union dues. I mean, Mark, there's an endless array of different offenses from these various groups.
Yeah, that's right. And we've tried to use state HIPAA and privacy laws to stop that type of action. In fact, we had a case in North Carolina where union officials posted Social Security numbers and other relevant personal information about people that didn't join the union, didn't pay dues. And so we brought a suit on behalf of 33 workers in North Carolina saying this was a violation of the state privacy law. And yet the North Carolina court said that these union officials were preempted because of federal labor policy, and they could dispose of this information any way they see fit. Now, if you or I did that, or if this electrician did this that owns a small business without this union demand, if he did it on his own, he would be in violation of a state privacy law, federal privacy law, the HIPAA laws that we talk about. But yet, union officials are exempt from that type of activity, and it goes right back to these privileges at Medicare and Medicaid.
It does. And here's the thing, just going back to the story about the electrician, the veterans, it's called Veterans Electric here in Wisconsin. If the trust fund, which is the union, it's the pension fund, if the trust fund is able to get the information in discovery, and the trust fund decides it wants to dispose of it by handing it over to the union local, and the union local decides they want to put these guys' Social Security numbers and addresses and cell phone numbers out to the public, public, then they're going to be bound by the same decision that affected the North Carolina workers that you brought suit on behalf of.
Well, we hope that wouldn't be the case, that maybe somebody else with a little more grasp of reality would decide differently. But under the North Carolina law, we lost at the lower court. We appealed to the Supreme Court in North Carolina and said, no. There's a federal preemption here. The National Labor Relations Act would rule, and therefore we're not going to hold them in violation of the state privacy law for information that if anyone else did it would be a violation.
Don't you think, Mark? And it may not stop states from trying to engage in overt illegal activity by creating a skim on major federal health care programs, and it may not stop union pension funds from trying to shake down little employers. But don't you think that it is high time we actually rethink the National Labor Relations Act and write the act in favor of worker freedom as opposed to in favor of giant political bodies that have enough power to destroy people's lives and can then point to the federal law and say, see, the federal law says we can do it?
I'm with you, Vicki. That's exactly right. It was written allegedly. There is language, flowery language in the National Labor Relations Act. It talks about employee rights. But over the course of 80 years now, over 80 years, that law has been interpreted to empower big business and big labor over small employees and independent-minded employees, for sure.
Yeah, and so this is what it's going to take. It's taking Ron Johnson on a fact-finding mission. I mean, you're saying stop. But, ultimately, Mark, what do you have to do if you actually want it to stop? I mean, do you have to bring a lawsuit to make it stop in the Medicaid skim?
Well, I think that might be an option, but certainly having an executive branch that's aware of it and understands it, and now you have the Senate, Senator Johnson, the chairman of the committee, that has oversight on these issues about the spending in the Medicaid and Medicare program. I mean, these are important developments. You just wish it could happen faster because this $200 million is being drained out of those providers' fees, Medicaid fees, right now.
And when we say provider, we don't mean healthcare clinic. We mean, family member. That is
personal care assistant.
Personal care assistant that oftentimes is a relative that is tasked with just taking care of somebody for very, very little dollars. It helps. It's not, it's not the end. No one's getting rich doing it. Let's put it that way. Mark Mix, thank you very much for jumping on the program today.
All right, Vicki, thank you.
Good to have you. Mark Mix, National Right to Work Foundation. We'll be right back.